So emergent curriculum is intended to nourish intelligences within the contextual relations with the histories and inheritances of a place that surround the educational protagonist. It emerges from in-depth study of a shared idea, situation, or a phenomenon or a concept. So with that said, emergent curriculum doesn't attend necessarily to the division of ideas into specific subjects or ideas to be quickly consumed or memorized, but rather curriculum is framed around the concept, and that concept is investigated and studied in the lived experience for long periods of time. So it's not a passive transmission of knowledge from adult to child, or from the environment to the child. It's an active composition between moving parts. Language and expression in emergent curriculum is not an isolated act. So for example, children's drawings, writings, and notes have purposes. So we're not conceptualizing children's ideas as just coming from this inner space inside their bodies and just being, flowed out freely into the world. But rather children's drawings, writings, notes, and drawings, notes of the educator are composed in relation with place. It just doesn't come from the human out into the world. It's made of the world. So children's ideas and passions matter, and the mediums through which that complex exchange happens also matter. So when we're thinking about materials in the space, the way that that classrooms are arranged, they're intended to enhance connectivity and relations in how ideas move beyond only the individual, but there are mediums through which ideas can take shape collectively. So learning becomes rich when concepts are not extracted into memorizable fragments via recitation, and when knowledge is cultivated in an authentic engagement with the complicated everyday worlds in which we live. So in this way, we're attending to the histories and presences that complicate curriculum making in many ways. So the concepts and ideas that are being studied are of the place. They're not just brought in on top of an existing situation. They are of the situation. So educators in an emergent curriculum highlight pedagogical opportunities by actively listening to children's real life inquiries and interests, as well as their own interests as educators. And then they cultivate pedagogical opportunities from these experiences. So in this sense, engaging with reading, writing, and literacy is intimately recognized as practices that are culturally situated and that are nurtured as modes of communication and interpretation that bring us closer to the world. So in this sense, when children are learning to read, or when we're thinking of literacy, this doesn't just happen out of nowhere. Writing and reading happens because something needs to be communicated, because something needs to be understood. So in an emerging curriculum, we're not just learning phonetics because it's that time of the year where we start to introduce phonetics. We're thinking about crafting ideas and how do our ideas get shared through written form. So emergent curriculum or living inquiry follows concepts and ideas as they emerge. And educators and children move with them, as Aoki says, from between to in between, resisting their solid in framing. So in order to stay with the complexities of ideas, we're not necessarily seeking to define them or name them, but we're trying to get an understanding of their essence. What are the puzzles? What are the tensions? What is it that needs to be figured out in this idea? So emerging curriculum disrupts an anthropocentric or human-centric or neoliberal logic of predictable, homogeneous, self-making processes. So children's multiple languages and processes of making rely on the relations of many. So they're interdependent components whose trajectories are entangled within what Donna Haraway calls complex, dynamic, responsive, situated, and historical systems. And so if we're thinking about knowledge as made of relations, it's very difficult to pin down and define or name it or wholly answer the questions that we're asking. So paying attention to materials and processes that exist beyond human self-making practices, making with offers a radical reconfiguration in the construction of knowledge and subjectivities by situating meaning within the ineffable, the irregular, and the impermanent moments with others, of the poetics of the lived experience. So these processes are not, again, an expression of inner worlds. They're not purely interpretive or representative. That is, that we're not seeking to name or wholly defy what it is that we're studying in an emergent curriculum or living inquiry. Coming from the child and into the world, or coming from the educator and into the world, but rather emerging curriculum speaks to an engagement where one meets another in an encounter, where something is generated, something that often falls outside of traditional languages of education that aim to measure, define, and contain. It's something generative and meaningful because it's made of relations and in relations. So again, thinking about pedagogy in an emergent curriculum, pedagogy is orienting in between spaces, in those encounters of the lived experience. So pedagogy, again, is that in-between space, that gap between theory and practice. And this is fundamentally different than psychology or developmentalism. If we're thinking pedagogy, we're thinking of the space between the human and the world, not only about the human or the construction of the self. We're situating our thinking in the in-between, in the relations, and composing this between space in ways which create conditions for new trajectories, for other possibilities. And as we discussed already, a pedagogical project is not about implementation or an application of a model. It's also not interested in fixing individual behavior or languages of intervention. Living inquiry has a pedagogical orientation toward integrity and wholeness that has something to do with health, healing, and the mending of a relation. And that's a quote from David Chardin in how he's speaking about curriculum in place, keeping ideas whole in their relations and in the places, their homes, he says, of where they emerged from, their histories. So in an emergent curriculum, the educator is somebody who is almost a professional marveler, somebody who is also a researcher, somebody who is an artful thinker. So educators articulate personal and collective images of what it means to be a pedagogue. And critically reflects upon the historical and geopolitical locations of these images. Educators connect these images to pedagogical intentions and decisions. They inquire about pedagogical visions that are relevant to children's worlds with others. And they negotiate tensions and contradictions that might arise between diverse pedagogical perspectives. So they're part of an ongoing dialogue with other educators. Educators inquire into, they slow down, and they experiment with pedagogies. And these ideas, this image of the educator, is borrowed from the Early Childhood Pedagogies Collaboratory. So in a post-structural or reconceptualist orientation to pedagogy and within an emergent curriculum, educators and children encounter the worlds in which they live, and educators make pedagogical judgments about what is educationally desirable. So they see moments with children as a pedagogical opportunity to organize further experiences that could enhance those problems, that could enhance the opportunities for something to be figured out, to be puzzled by something. So in an emergent curriculum, a rich educator complexifies and deepens the educational value of these experiences, of these seemingly mundane, everyday encounters with children through collective research practices with children. So educators and children are sort of co-researchers in study. Educators are working within educators that are working within this orientation have a deep understanding of the BC Early Learning Framework, and they situate knowledge within the lived experience. So if curriculum is unfolding in lived experiences and encounters, then the educator is no longer positioned as the sole holder of knowledge. In an emergent curriculum, the educator needs a community of co-thinkers, often outside of the educational space, because the educator doesn't hold all of the knowledge. The knowledge exists and is made in community and in relation. So an educator is an artful thinker who is interested in co-curating pedagogical spaces and encounters that reference the social and cultural milieu surrounding the educational protagonist. So educators are deeply involved in ongoing dialogue about current literature, not only in the field of education, but also in other disciplines that are relevant to their questions of inquiry, to their concepts, to their topics. And really to their research questions. In this image, the educator is also actively referencing community art, poetry, philosophy, local aesthetics to further enhance their pedagogical work with children. So some conditions that emergent curriculum is reliant on are that programs, early childhood programs, must be led by pedagogical commitments. And these are particular values that respond to the particularities of the program's context that orient the practices of the program. So pedagogical commitments define the purposes and processes that would orient pedagogical decisions. So pedagogical commitments are understood as particular values that orient the program in context. And pedagogical commitments allow educators situated in a context to be able to make decisions around curriculum. So these commitments are developed so that a program attends to local challenges and issues that are faced by children and families within the program. So beginning with a curriculum framework, for example, the BC Early Learning Framework, one of the commitments is to learn to live well together. So programs develop pedagogical commitments that orient the Early Childhood Center to engage in practices that address the issues that are identified, and to remain situated in that commitment to learn to live well together. What does it mean to share a life together? And so these pedagogical commitments and pedagogical decision-making processes that emerge from that sustain the emergence of an ongoing inquiry rather than implementing or implanting activities that fulfill a curriculum goal or outcome. So educators make pedagogical decisions in inquiry work with children that reflect these commitments. And educators often return and go back to these commitments as inquiry is emerging in the lived experience, to commit us to what is education for? What is this project trying to do? So educators engage a pedagogy of listening and approach this listening with a pedagogical intention. So educators attend to the flows and intensities of our work with children, and this is ongoing and requires us to propel this work by listening to children's ideas, theories, questions, and taking them seriously and building curricula around these moments. So with their pedagogical commitments in mind, educators return to the question, who is the subject I'm educating for? What do I want my pedagogy to produce, and what am I accountable to? So there's an active, reflexive nature in this. It's not something that just comes from above and is implemented and we assume it as the truth. Emergent curriculum requires an educator who is a critical thinker, who's really in response to what is happening.